Hey everyone. This is Six Path Weeb, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we're diving into part 2 of our fanfic. What if a female Deku had a transmutation quirk? Disclaimer, this content is purely for entertainment and discussion. I do not own any of the anime footage used, full credit goes to the original creators and copyright holders. Let's get started. Waking up was a slow and arduous process. Consciousness ebbed and flowed, slipping through Deku's grasp like sand through fingers. Each time, the pull of unconsciousness was too strong, dragging her back before she could fully awaken. But finally, after what felt like countless attempts, her eyes fluttered open. Expecting to see the familiar All Might-themed decorations of her room, she instead found herself staring at an expanse of stark white. The walls, the ceiling, the sheets, everything around her was a sterile shade of white. Even the cast wrapped around her arm blended into the surroundings. Wait, when had she broken her arm? She furrowed her brows, studying the firm material encasing her limb, her mind struggling to piece together hazy, fragmented memories. A soft gasp caught her attention. Deku. The voice was unmistakable, her mother's. Even the gentle tone felt overwhelming to her ears. It was only then that she noticed the quiet hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping surrounding her. Turning her head sluggishly toward the sound, she saw her mother leaning over the bed, eyes brimming with unshed tears. She hesitated for only a moment before carefully embracing her daughter. The hug was gentle, far softer than the ones Deku usually welcomed, but even that slight pressure sent a dull ache through her body. Sensing her discomfort, her mother quickly released her. What happened? Deku rasped, only now realizing how parched her throat felt. Her mother immediately reached for a cup of water from the small bedside table and carefully held it to her lips. Grateful, Deku took slow, measured sips. The cool liquid was soothing, yet she hadn't realized how dehydrated she was until she finished the entire cup. Clearing her throat softly, she met her mother's gaze once more and repeated, "What happened?" This time, her voice was steadier. Her mother offered a strained smile. "You got hurt. While saving Katsuki." Her voice trembled, the weight of emotion making it difficult to continue. "Ah," Deku murmured, glancing around the room once more. Her mother remained silent, seeming relieved that she was finally awake. A sudden knock at the door disrupted the quiet moment. The doorknob twisted, and a middle-aged man entered, his white coat and clipboard immediately identifying him as a doctor. "You're awake," he said with a warm smile. "That's wonderful news." His reassuring demeanor put them both at ease, though the smile gradually faded as he glanced at the notes in his hands. "Now, as glad as I am to see you recovering, we need to discuss your injuries." From the way her mother's expression dimmed, Deku guessed she had already been told. "Your most severe injury is your arm," the doctor continued, gesturing toward the cast. "We had to administer a quirk suppression serum to properly treat it. Once that was done, we assessed the extent of the damage caused by using your quirk." His brow lifted slightly as he read further. "Both your radius and ulna sustained multiple fractures near the center. The force of your quirk's recoil caused microfractures throughout the rest of the bone structure." He paused before adding, "Your humerus also suffered several microfractures, and your shoulder was dislocated." Deku remained silent, absorbing the information. "You also had minor skull fractures," the doctor added, looking up from the clipboard. "Frankly, you're very fortunate you didn't sustain spinal injuries." A breath Deku hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips. The thought of a worse outcome sent a chill through her. If things had gone differently, she might have been facing a much more serious reality. With that said, the doctor continued gently, "You should make a full recovery. But please, don't use your quirk in such an extreme manner again. Just because you were fortunate this time doesn't mean you'll always be so lucky." Deku suddenly found the folds of her blanket very interesting, unable to meet his gaze. "For your mother's sake," the doctor added softly, "please be careful." He offered a small nod before stepping toward the door. "I'll notify the nurse that you're awake. You must be hungry." Deku gave a small nod, and with that, the doctor exited the room. Silence settled between mother and daughter again, but Deku was the first to break it. "Is Kachan okay?" To her relief, her mother nodded. Even though she had endured significant injuries, knowing she had protected her childhood friend made it all worthwhile. After a brief pause, her mother suddenly perked up as if remembering something. "Oh," she exclaimed, startling Deku slightly. Rummaging through her purse, she retrieved a small envelope. "All Might left you this." Her heart pounded at the thought of what her hero could have sent her. An autograph? A signed poster? Wait. What was that beeping? Oh, the heart monitor, She was getting way too excited. Much to her surprise, it wasn't a poster but a neatly sealed letter. Well, she mused, it's not what I expected. Her mother gently placed the envelope in her lap. Deku reached for it, wincing slightly as her sore fingers grasped the edges. Carefully, she brought it to her lips and used her teeth to tear open the envelope. A folded piece of paper slipped out, and she unfolded it with delicate precision. Her mother watched curiously as she began reading. The letter was short and to the point, yet Deku's eyes scanned over every detail obsessively, taking in the handwriting of her idol. The letters were large, the spacing wide, as if written with the same commanding presence that defined All Might himself. Amusingly, every word was in capital letters, making it feel as though his booming voice echoed in her head as she read. Young Midoriya. I wish to speak with you in person. We have something important to discuss regarding both our futures. All Might. Right beneath the signature was a hastily written number. Deku nearly had a moment of overwhelming shock, again. All Might wanted to speak with her? Why? What could possibly be so important that it couldn't be written in the letter? Most importantly, though, she had All Might's number. Mumbling. Her mother's voice pulled her from her hushed ramblings. Deku glanced at her apologetically. In return, her mother offered the same expression. She didn't like interrupting, but Deku had asked her to stop her whenever she slipped into that habit. She sighed. It seemed like she would never quite rid herself of it. With Katsuki. Katsuki clenched his fists as frustration coursed through him, his head throbbing from the overwhelming emotions. Years of relentless training, countless hours of honing his quirk, was it all meaningless? His teeth ground together as he lifted his hands, staring at the marks that crisscrossed his calloused palms. The largest scar sat at the center of his right hand, a reminder of the first time he ever activated his quirk. Over time, the burns and scars had refined, becoming more precise as he gained control. His once soft skin had toughened, hardened from years of training. He had once told Deku that his quirk was nearly perfect. And it was true. His quirk was powerful, both offensively, allowing for large-scale attacks, and strategically, letting him propel himself across distances with explosions. His quirk was strong. But he was not strong enough. He would never admit it to Deku, but deep down, he knew it was true. For years, even the smallest explosion had left his hands raw, covered in painful blisters. He had gone to school more times than he could count with his hands bandaged, brushing off the concerns of teachers and classmates alike with a forced grin. The only reason he could now use his quirk without constantly injuring himself was due to sheer determination. He had subjected his hands to extreme conditions, toughening his skin against the heat. It had been agonizing, but he had endured it. And yet, in overcoming one challenge, he had discovered another weakness. His body struggled to withstand the recoil. Small explosions sent his arms jerking back, while larger ones had, on more than one occasion, dislocated his shoulders. Mastering his quirk had been one thing. Strengthening his body to handle it had been another entirely. Just when he thought he had reached a point where he could stand tall and say he was strong, he had failed. He had been too slow. Too weak. Unable to stop the villain. And because of that, Deku had been hospitalized for 3 days, unconscious. He had heard time and time again that a true hero needed the spirit of self-sacrifice. But Deku took that idea and pushed it beyond reason. His vision blurred, a sharp sting forming in his eyes. Was he crying? Frustration surged through him, and he struck the nearest wall with a clenched fist. Pain shot through his arm, but he barely registered it. Just as he was about to let out another exasperated sigh, his bedroom door swung open. His mother stood in the doorway, a satisfied expression on her face. What's your problem now? Katsuki snapped, though his voice cracked slightly. He wiped at his eyes hastily. Mitsuki's expression softened. Deku, she said gently. Katsuki stiffened. So what? He muttered, still rubbing his eyes. I was worried too, you know. His breath hitched. Was? What did she mean by? She's awake. Mitsuki grinned, holding up the car keys that dangled from her pinky finger. Get changed. Visiting hours are almost over. At the hospital. The green-haired woman turned to the 2 young men, who were currently locked in a tense staring contest. She opened her mouth to speak, but a dismissive wave from the blonde's mother made her pause. The tension in the room was palpable. Both young men swallowed nervously, neither willing to break eye contact first. Deku had remained silent since Katsuki entered, and the blonde had been equally quiet. Thanks. Katsuki finally broke the silence. Deku gave a small nod. Sorry, she murmured. You better be, Katsuki muttered, his brow twitching before he let out a deep sigh. I'm sorry too. A chuckle slipped from Dekuli's lips. Did the great Katsuki just apologize to me? Shut it, nerd, Katsuki snapped, but the usual bite in his tone was missing. Dekuli started laughing but winced midway, clutching her chest at the sharp pain. Don't do that again, Katsuki scolded, his voice filled with frustration. I don't need you ending up in the hospital because of me. Dekuli shrugged. You'd have done the same if the situation were reversed. Katsuki huffed but nodded, and the two exchanged a slow fist bump. The 2 weeks that followed were painfully uneventful. Her mother visited every day, fussing over her and making sure she ate properly. Katsuki was a constant presence as well, dropping by daily with notes and ensuring she didn't fall behind in their studies. He was a surprisingly effective tutor, though he complained endlessly about it cutting into his training time. All Might had also checked in regularly. It had taken Dekuli a few days to summon the courage to text him, but when she finally sent a simple, "I'm awake," he had responded almost instantly with a thumbs up and a request to meet in person. Their conversations became frequent after that. Mostly, All Might asked about her recovery, making sure she was eating well and resting enough. It was a strange experience, having someone worry about her nearly as much as her mother did, but she appreciated it nonetheless. And now, after what felt like an eternity, she was finally taking her first steps outside the hospital. Her mother held her uninjured hand firmly, ready to support her if needed. The moment she stepped outside, she inhaled deeply, savoring the fresh air and the warmth of the sun. Pulling out her phone, she smiled at the familiar All Might-themed lock screen before opening his contact. Out of the hospital. She typed slowly with her free hand. All Might's reply was immediate, his enthusiasm practically radiating through the screen. Wonderful. Then came another message. Meet me tonight at Takoba Beach, 8 p.m. It is of utmost importance. Dekuli exhaled, already bracing herself for her mother's inevitable reaction. Going out the same day she was discharged? That was going to be a conversation. The scene replayed in his mind repeatedly, like a mantra. The green-haired young individual had sprinted forward, the look of urgency clear on their face, yet their feet never faltered. Dekuli had taken action when the heroes around them hesitated, when even he had hesitated. Dekuli's plan had been bold, relying entirely on the assumption that the villain's eyes were a weakness. Fortunately, that assumption had been correct. In those crucial seconds, they had managed to partially free the blonde hostage. Though only his mouth had been released from the villain's grasp, those fleeting moments had been enough for him to gasp in much-needed air. Yet, what had truly unsettled him was the sight of Dekuli's quirk in action. It had momentarily paralyzed him, not out of shock, but out of deep, lingering fear. There were very few things that could truly shake Toshinori Yagi to his core, but that particular quirk was one of them. He remembered its name vividly, transmutation. The ability to alter one's own body into various forms at will. The villain who once wielded it had spoken of its capabilities with a chilling certainty, his monologue etched into Toshinori's memory like words carved in stone. He had explained the power in excruciating detail, his voice filled with an unsettling amusement as he manipulated his surroundings. He had done so the last time they faced each other, just before using the enhanced form of that quirk, amplified by several others, to inflict a devastating wound on Toshinori. Toshinori had believed that battle would be the last time he encountered that fearsome ability, the same power that had taken the life of his adoptive mother. He had been certain that with his final confrontation against that man, the legacy of that quirk had ended. But he had been wrong. That power was still alive, and it coursed through Dekuli's veins. Though the young hero in training lacked the experience and control that the previous wielder had, the process of transmutation remained the same. The faint glow, the shifting of limbs, the metallic hum as parts reconfigured, every aspect was eerily familiar. Toshinori's brows furrowed as he clenched his teeth. He wasn't certain of the connection between Dekuli and that man, but the similarities were undeniable. The piercing green eyes, the wild, untamed hair, though distinct in some ways, they were hauntingly alike. Perhaps he was reaching, making assumptions that weren't fair to the young hero. But the resemblance was difficult to ignore. If Dekuli truly had ties to one of the most formidable villains in history, All for One, then an even greater question loomed over him. If they were indeed that man's child, why hadn't they inherited All for One? Or had they? Was it possible that Dekuli possessed every quirk that All for One once wielded? The mere thought was terrifying. That was why Toshinori had insisted on meeting Dekuli in person. He needed to understand, to uncover the truth. The way Dekuli spoke of their father suggested they had no knowledge of his true identity. That wouldn't be surprising, given the kind of man All for One was. If he had, at some point, decided to start a family, it wouldn't be out of character for him to abandon them when they no longer served a purpose. If that were the case, Toshinori saw an opportunity, one that he could not ignore. He could guide Deku, show them the path of a true hero. They already aspired to be one, and with the right influence, they could be shaped into a force for good. But the risk was immense. If a villain managed to manipulate Deku before Toshinori could intervene, the consequences could be catastrophic. A child possessing that much power could one day grow into an unstoppable adversary. With Toshinori nearing the end of his time as a hero, society could not afford another villain of such magnitude. He had debated this issue in his mind countless times. Was it truly wise to train a student solely because of their potential connection to his greatest enemy? The idea seemed reckless, even irrational. Yet, the risk of doing nothing was far too great. If, by some unimaginable chance, Deku was related to All for One, Toshinori couldn't allow them to walk down the same dark path. He exhaled deeply. He had already made his decision. Deku would become his student, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of the entire world. Toshinori hadn't known what to expect when he arrived at Takoba Beach, but it certainly wasn't this. All Might, at least in his frail, weakened form, was perched on a dismantled car seat, which was haphazardly positioned atop a heap of discarded metal and debris. His arms were folded, chin resting against his hands, his posture suggesting deep contemplation. The moment his bright blue eyes met Deku's, however, his expression shifted. In an instant, the lanky, ghostly figure transformed into the towering symbol of peace. Young Midoriya. His voice thundered, reverberating through the air and making Deku's chest tighten with anticipation. Please. All Might continued, effortlessly lifting an old refrigerator from a pile of scrap metal with one hand. He placed it down and gestured to it grandly. Have a seat, Gah. Before he could finish, he coughed violently, a splatter of red staining his lips. His muscular form deflated as he wheezed, leaning onto the fridge for support. I really should stop doing that, he muttered, catching his breath. Deku blinked, watching as the deep imprints left by All Might's fingers dented the refrigerator's metal exterior. The sheer strength behind such casual movements was awe-inspiring. Tentatively, they took a seat beside him, their heart hammering in their chest. Even in his weakened state, Toshinori towered over them. His thoughtful expression made Deku even more anxious. Before the pro-hero could speak, Deku blurted out the question lingering in their mind. Why? Toshinori arched a brow. Why what? Why did you ask to meet me in person, All Might? As I mentioned earlier, young Midoriya, it's something of great importance, something that affects both of our futures. He then gave a small, dismissive wave. And while I'm in this form, please call me Toshinori Yagi. It's best to avoid any slip-ups regarding the nature of my quirk. Deku nodded in understanding. Toshinori leaned forward slightly. I have a proposition for you, something I couldn't explain properly in a letter. Deku tilted their head. A proposition? How would you like to be my student and train under me? For a moment, Deku's mind went completely blank. Why? They asked, unable to contain their surprise. Toshinori smiled, placing a reassuring hand on their shoulder. Because I see potential in you, my boy. He gestured meaningfully. Most legendary heroes have stories of their early days, moments when they acted without hesitation. Do you know what all those stories have in common? He paused before answering his own question. They all moved before they could even think. Toshinori's expression softened. But you went beyond that. You knowingly put yourself in harm's way to protect another. That, young Midoriya, is the essence of a true hero. The willingness to sacrifice for others. Deku swallowed hard. He had known his actions had been reckless. He understood that waiting for a hero with a more suitable quirk might have been the safer choice. But standing by while someone suffered had never been an option for him. Toshinori flexed his fingers slightly. Your quirk is powerful, but I could tell you weren't used to controlling its full strength. He gestured toward Deku's injured arm. Deku chuckled nervously, nodding. With a grin, All Might flexed an arm, though in his frail form, the gesture was more comical than intimidating. My quirk works the same way. It grants unimaginable strength, but the body must be trained to handle it. Deku hesitated for a moment before murmuring, your quirk. You have one for all, don't you? Toshinori coughed violently, struggling to contain the blood that escaped with each breath. His expression turned serious as he fixed Deku with an intense gaze. How do you know about that? His voice carried a sharp edge, sending a shiver down the young teen's spine. My father, Deku blurted out. He had a small library, and he wrote extensively about quirks. That still didn't explain how her father had knowledge of One for All. All Might clenched his jaw, his suspicions solidifying. The possibility that Deku was connected to All for One became increasingly difficult to ignore. What exactly do you know about One for All? Toshinori asked, his eyes filled with curiosity. Well, I know that it's a quirk that allows the user to accumulate energy and transfer it to another person. That was the fundamental explanation she recalled from her father's writings. Toshinori nodded, acknowledging the accuracy. Is that all? Deku shook her head. It's an enhancement-type quirk that enables the user to channel stored energy into different parts of their body. If directed to the muscles, it increases strength. If focused on the skin, it enhances durability. If combined with another quirk, it amplifies its power significantly. She was summarizing the extensive notes her father had left behind, avoiding the overwhelming depth of detail her father had recorded about previous wielders of the quirk. Her father, she realized, had never been particularly interested in the individuals who possessed these abilities, unlike Deku, who deeply admired heroes. Instead, her father had focused on the mechanics of quirks, analyzing how they could be utilized and even combined with others. The idea of merging quirks was something Deku had never truly considered before. Perhaps her father had been a strategist of some kind? Regarding One for All, her father had taken an especially detailed approach. He had dedicated 8 sections to what he referred to as manifestations, documenting how the quirk evolved with each new wielder. He never listed names, only identifying them numerically. Initially, the quirk provided only a slight energy boost and marginally increased stamina. However, with each new successor, its power grew exponentially. By the time it reached what her father called the 8th manifestation, the quirk had transformed from a minor enhancement into overwhelming physical strength. The descriptions closely resembled the abilities of her favorite hero, the power to topple buildings with a single strike, incredible speed, and extraordinary resilience. It sounded just like All Might's abilities. Toshinori cleared his throat. Deku realized she had been muttering again. That's a rather insightful analysis, young one, Toshinori admitted. However, I must ask that you keep this information to yourself. My quirk is a closely guarded secret, known only to a select few, he sighed. And now, you as well. Deku nodded silently. Do you know anything about your father? All Might asked. Deku hesitated, then shook her head. I don't remember much about him. And honestly, I don't think I want to, she admitted, her tone bitter. My mother told me he's in a coma. He lost a fight against a hero years ago. Her hands clenched into fists as frustration bubbled within her. Talking about her father always stirred a deep sense of unease. When did this happen? All Might asked, his tone laced with suspicion. About 5 years ago. Toshinori's hand instinctively pressed against his shirt, over the massive scar hidden beneath. That was the same time he had suffered his near-fatal injury. My girl, the veteran hero began, his voice steady but solemn. I believe I might know who your father is. Deku's head snapped up. You do? Excitement flickered in her eyes, but All Might's serious expression quickly sobered her. Toshinori took a deep breath, steadying himself. I sincerely hope I'm mistaken, but the evidence is too strong to ignore. Deku leaned in, listening intently. You resemble him. You have the same quirk. Your father was a formidable individual who fell into a coma around the same time I sustained my injury. And most importantly, he possessed knowledge about my quirk, something very few people know. The weight of his words sank in. It might not be my place to say this, Toshinori continued carefully, but if anyone deserves to know the truth, it's you. Based on everything I've gathered, I suspect your father is someone I once fought, a powerful villain. He stopped short of revealing just how infamous the man truly was. That was a truth Deku was not yet ready to hear. Not that it matters anymore, Toshinori said with a forced sense of finality. As you mentioned, he's in a coma. The statement was a deliberate deception. Toshinori knew all too well that All for One was still active, though he had remained elusive, even to him. Choosing to shift the conversation, All Might straightened up, instantly expanding into his muscular form. Now, back to the task at hand. His voice boomed with renewed enthusiasm. So, what do you say, young one? Will you become my student? A second, unspoken question lingered in his mind. Will you prove yourself worthy to be my successor? It had taken nearly a month, but at last, Deku felt confident enough to say that she had regained proficient control over her quirk in the arm she had previously injured. Though her doctor had advised against removing the cast so soon, she had taken it off 2 weeks prior and immediately resumed training. To maximize efficiency, she combined rehabilitation with quirk practice, flexing her arm and wrist while transmuting small patches of her skin into metal. She needed to ensure she had the precise control required for complex transmutations before actively implementing them. After all, one of her advanced transmutations had been the very reason she had ended up injured in the first place. Today marked a milestone. She had finally passed her self-imposed test. She held up both arms and cycled through a series of transmutations in rapid succession. Before one transformation was complete, she would initiate the next. To an observer, her arms appeared to shimmer and flicker like a strobe light, shifting between various metallic hues. In theory, the technique was simple, but in practice, it required intense focus, especially since her previously injured arm lagged slightly behind her left. At first, she had feared this delay was a lasting consequence of her injury. However, after several hours of rigorous training, she had successfully restored her transmutation speed to its previous level. Eager to prove herself to All Might, she had requested a meeting the moment she achieved a result she was satisfied with. And now, she stood on the worn-down shore of Tacoba Beach, watching as All Might struck an exaggerated pose atop a pile of discarded scrap metal. A flicker of recognition passed through his eyes as he spotted her, but he remained in place, maintaining his dramatic stance. Deku exhaled a quiet sigh. All Might always had a flair for theatrics. So, she began, why are we here again? Because, young one, this, All Might spread his arms wide, gesturing to their surroundings, is your training. What? His response was a hearty, booming laugh, and despite herself, Deku couldn't help but grin, even if a little uncertainly. His enthusiasm was contagious. You are going to use your quirk to clear this entire beach. And while you do so, I will supervise and provide guidance on the fundamentals of becoming a hero. Deku blinked, taking in the vast expanse of debris before her. Piles of garbage and discarded metal covered nearly every inch of the beach. Did All Might truly expect her to clear all of it? You have, the hero suddenly coughed into his hand, his body trembling slightly as he cleared his throat. When he pulled his hand away, he raised 6 fingers, 3 on each hand. 6 months, he stated hoarsely. 6 months? That didn't seem too bad. In fact, she was certain she could finish in half that time. Wasting no time, Deku activated her quirk. A soft glow emanated from her hands, and to All Might's surprise, her ears also gave off a faint luminescence. She swiftly initiated her transmutations. Her hands underwent a relatively simple transformation, but her ears required a far more intricate process. She had spent weeks studying speakers, microphones, and acoustic devices, carefully dismantling and analyzing them to perfect the technique. The goal was to create an ultra-sensitive sonar ability, allowing her to perceive her surroundings through sound. Within moments, her right hand had reshaped into a sleek, black metal rod with a thick sphere at the end, while her left hand took on the form of a flat, onyx-colored board. Holding out the metallic board, she brought the rod down against it with a sharp clang. All Might flinched slightly at the sudden noise, shifting uncomfortably as the sound reverberated through the air. Deku closed her eyes and continued striking the hammer against the anvil, each impact producing a resonant chime. She repeated the motion a dozen times, each strike growing stronger than the last. After finishing, she remained still for a moment, allowing the glow to fade from her hands before they reverted to their normal state. A second later, her ears also returned to their usual form as she opened her eyes. All Might was watching her with evident curiosity. He did not voice his question, but it was clear in his expression. She offered a sheepish smile. Sorry about that, she chuckled. I wanted to map out the area, and this was the fastest way to do it. His puzzled expression did not fade, and she couldn't blame him. From his perspective, all she had done was strike 2 oddly shaped metal objects together. You know how bats use sound waves for echolocation? She prompted. All Might nodded hesitantly. It's kind of like that. I transmuted my ears so they could detect the echoes bouncing off solid objects. This lets me create a mental map of my surroundings without relying on sight alone. All Might's eyebrows lifted, not in confusion, but in admiration. You can do that with your quirk? He asked, astonishment evident in his voice. Deku nodded with a confident grin. And a whole lot more. This time, it was All Might who grinned back. Training young Deku would certainly prove to be an exciting journey. Toshinori Yagi had to admit, he was thoroughly impressed. Day by day, he observed as Deku diligently cleared away heaps of debris from Tacoba Beach, gradually restoring the once popular location to its former beauty. She possessed remarkable strength. While the green-haired young woman certainly had the build of an athlete, All Might hadn't expected her lean muscles to exhibit such extraordinary lifting power. He was pleased to be proven wrong. Deku could effortlessly move heavy loads, and Toshinori could only assume her strength stemmed from rigorous training related to her quirk. After all, a quirk like hers required significant physical prowess. One couldn't simply transform their arms into dense metal without possessing the necessary muscle mass to lift and utilize them effectively. What impressed him even more, however, was the versatility of her quirk. He had witnessed numerous instances where Deku used transmutation to lift stubborn pieces of metal. One particularly memorable moment was when she dismantled an entire scrapped car using only a crowbar and a hammer. It had been a fascinating display of skill. On days when she was especially eager to demonstrate her abilities, Deku would make small objects vanish into her hands, converting them into dust or even oxygen. Apparently, she could transmute smaller items, but she avoided doing so frequently due to the significant energy it required. Now, on the 85th day of her training, Toshinori arrived at the beach to find it completely cleared. Deku stood triumphantly atop a fully loaded moving truck, a confident smile on her face, as if silently declaring, "I told you I could do it." Overwhelmed with pride, he instinctively transformed into his muscular form, applauding with enthusiastic claps. In response, Deku playfully bowed, placing a hand beneath her abdomen in a dramatic flourish. The two shared a light-hearted laugh before she gracefully leapt down from the pile of scrap. Toshinori noticed the excitement in her eyes, the eagerness to prove herself once more to her hero. He had to admit, he admired her unwavering determination. In many ways, she reminded him of himself in his younger years. Placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, he smiled warmly. They stood in a brief but comfortable silence before Deku finally spoke. "So," she asked with a bright grin, "what's next, sensei?" Toshinori responded with his signature boisterous laugh. Running a hand through his golden spikes, he plucked a single strand of hair. "Young lady," he declared, his voice filled with pride. "Not only did you pass my test, you completed it in half the expected time. It's rare for me to be this impressed, but you have exceeded all my expectations. This test was not only to assess your worthiness as my student but also to determine if you are capable of carrying on my legacy. And now, I pass on to you this sacred responsibility, cultivated by generations. You are worthy of inheriting One for All." With that, he held out the strand of hair for her to take. "Now, eat this." Deku hesitated, swallowing nervously. She understood that One for All was transferred through DNA, but the idea of swallowing a strand of hair still felt a little odd. Nevertheless, she complied. As she did, the number one hero watched her with a proud expression. It was a surreal moment, and the full weight of what had just happened hadn't entirely settled in yet. She was now the 9th wielder of One for All, so why didn't she feel any different? Sensing her confusion, the now depowered Toshinori chuckled. "Your body needs time to digest it before you experience any effects, my girl." "Ah. That makes sense." She nearly facepalmed. Of course, it seemed obvious now that he had explained it. "So, what happens next?" she asked, looking at him expectantly. Toshinori gave her a reassuring smile. "For today, you rest. We need to allow One for All to fully integrate into your system before we continue with active training." Deku nodded. "Hey, All Might." Toshinori shook his head, lifting a hand. "What did I tell you, young Midoriya? When I'm in this form, please refer to me as Yagi." She flushed slightly, embarrassed. He had reminded her of this countless times over the past 2 months, but it still felt unnatural to address her hero so casually. "Hey, Yagi-san?" He nodded in approval, giving her a thumbs up. "Would you like to have dinner with my mother and me after training tomorrow?" What happened next was something Deku had never expected to see, All Might blushing and waving his arms in a flustered manner. I. For the first time, she realized that perhaps she wasn't the only one with a tendency to stutter. "I wouldn't want to impose." She gave him a bright smile. "Nonsense. We'd be more than happy to have you." Toshinori hesitated before offering a sheepish smile, scratching the back of his head.
I suppose I don't see why not."
Her smile widened at his agreement. "Great. I'll see you tomorrow, then?" The blonde hero nodded. "Tomorrow." Deku had to admit, she didn't feel much different, even long after she had reluctantly consumed the strand of hair that All Might had given her. There was only a lingering sense of unease, though she suspected it had more to do with her nervousness than any actual transformation taking place within her body. As she settled into bed, resting her head against a soft pillow, An unexpected sensation washed over her. At first, it was a gentle warmth coursing through her veins, almost comforting. But gradually, that warmth intensified, growing hotter until it became nearly unbearable, like molten energy flowing through her bloodstream. A similar heat radiated from her chest, as if an unseen force had pressed something searingly hot against her skin. Instinctively, she wanted to kick off the blankets, hoping to cool down, but she couldn't move. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and when she tried to shift a finger, a foot, anything, her body refused to respond. Panic surged through her. She could still see, still feel, yet she had no control over her own movements. It was an overwhelming sensation, like being trapped within herself. Her breathing quickened as she darted her eyes around the room, the only part of her body that seemed to obey her will. Then, without warning, her entire form convulsed. The sudden force of the movement sent her tumbling off the bed, landing hard against the floor with a heavy thud. A sharp jolt of pain shot through her, but before she could even register it fully, something else caught her attention. Her arms began to glow. It was the familiar glow of a transmutation, yet something was different. The usual metallic hue spread across her skin, but it wasn't uniform. There were gaps, places where her veins remained untouched by the transformation. A flicker of unease crept in as those same veins gave off a faint red glow. At first, it was subtle, but then the light intensified, turning a vibrant crimson. With every pulse of color, a sharp ache followed, deepening the discomfort. She lay there motionless, watching as the glow gradually shifted, first to a soft orange, then to a brilliant green. Arcs of energy crackled around her arms, twisting and curling like living currents of electricity, mirroring the colors now coursing through her veins. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The pain vanished. The burning sensation faded. She watched in quiet disbelief as the metallic transformation on her arm slowly unraveled, peeling away as if drawn toward the luminous veins beneath. Bit by bit, the silver sheen receded, leaving only smooth skin behind. As the last traces of energy flickered out, a heavy exhaustion settled over her. Her body felt drained, as though all her strength had been sapped in an instant. The effort to stay awake became impossible. Her eyelids grew heavy, and before she could even attempt to rise, sleep overtook her. With a quiet sigh, her head rested against the floor, and everything faded to darkness. That's all for now, guys. Make sure to subscribe for more exciting and fun content. Thank you all for your support, truly grateful. 6 Path Weeb.